At this time, I'd like to invite our next panel up to the stage. I am honored to have join me four of our legislators for a legislature panel to discuss the session that just concluded. Yes.
Is this thing on?
No PowerPoint for this one. So all of these legislators know groundwater. They understand the importance of that valuable resource, and they've shown a commitment over this session and sessions before to securing Texas's water future at the legislature. Representative King from House District 80, a longtime public servant, has served in the House since 1995. He's the chairman of the House Licensing and Administrative Procedures Committee and is also a member of the Natural Resources Committee. He also serves as a member of the Edwards Aquifer Legislative Oversight Committee and on the Energy Council. Representative Lyle Larson, to my right, House District 122, is a lifelong resident of the San Antonio area, and hopefully that made for a relatively easy commute this morning for you. Representative Larson has a long history of public service as well. Was first elected to the San Antonio City Council back in 1991 and has been in the State House since 2010. Currently serves as the chair of the House Natural Resources Committee. He's also a member of the House Committee on Redistricting and the International Relations and Economic Development Committee. Representative Poncho Nevarez from House District 74, which I learned is the largest House district in the country, has represented that district since 2013. Also a member of the House Natural Resources Committee. He also has served on the Texas Sunset Committee. And then Senator Charles Perry joins us today from Lubbock. Thank you for making the trip down. A lifelong West Texan, represents Senate District 28, first elected to the Texas Senate in 2014 after serving 2 terms in the Texas House. He serves as the chair of the Senate Water and Rural Affairs Committee and is the vice chair of the Health and Human Services Committee. He has a long list of committees. They go on and on. Also sits on the Senate Committee for Agriculture, Criminal Justice, Finance and Transportation, and co-chairs the State Water Implementation Fund for Texas, the SWIFT Fund Advisory Committee. So we're delighted to have you all here today. Hopefully I got all those facts right. Hopefully your staff keeps your websites updated. Thank you for being here. Really pleased to have you. What we want to do today is really just explore the themes and the outcomes from the 86th legislative session, and then look forward. What's going to happen over the interim? What do you want to see happen, and what might we see coming up in the 87th? So with that, we've got the 86th in the rearview mirror, and I just would like each of you to briefly comment on what you consider kind of the important groundwater themes that you saw during this session. And Representative Larson, perhaps we could start with you. I think the microphone is... Perfect. Sorry.
Well, thank y'all. Thank y'all for inviting all 4 of us come out and talk to you about the legislative session. Groundwater, we didn't really talk about drought this time around. We talked about floods, and Senator Perry carried one of the key bills that we passed in the legislature dealing with floods. But with that, opportunities with flooding and groundwater dealing with aquifer storage and recovery, we passed a series of bills dealing with the regulatory format of ASRs. Also, we passed the bill dealing with desalination of the brackish column and the regulatory framework built around it, working in conjunction with groundwater districts. Those were 2 pivotal pieces of legislation that came through both of our committees in dealing with that. And then the balancing of state law in dealing with case law. I think all of y'all in this room have got property owners that are concerned about their rights and their ability to pump water and use it for what they deem important to them, whether it be using it in ag, using industrial, selling it to municipalities, transporting the water. And I think we'll continue to focus on trying to figure out the local aspect of controlling water and then the property rights that need to be exercised based on what case law is. So we dealt with sort of a regional approach as well, looking at groundwater management from a regional standpoint and just not at a local level. So those were the issues that I saw from a groundwater perspective.
Senator Perry?
Yeah, so basically the session took on, lost all the oxygen in the room and went to Harvey. After Harvey hit in August, I think everybody's energies and efforts kind of refocused. In that, there's opportunities, as Chairman Larson stated, to capture water supplies. I think it was HB 720 where we capture the excess over those rains. The retread of 1066, some of those derivatives came out of the flood report and some of the flood things we were doing, but 1066 synchronizing the permits and production permits. So on a water district level, not a whole lot of sexy big moves, but common tweaks that made sense that I think landowners benefited from, our property rights, as well as just efficiencies on getting those permits out. So hopefully next session will be a little more focused on water supply, which involves you guys. But to be truthful, I think the day Harvey hit, everybody's focused, and rightfully so, and Governor and Lieutenant Governor with their charges came out pretty quickly. And then on the House side, there was charges. So out of that, you had Senate Bill 8, statewide flood plan, similar to a water supply plan. Senate Bill 7, which is funding for mitigation and planning for municipals and jurisdictions going forward. And Senate Bill 6 doesn't get talked a lot about, and Chancellor Sharp was instrumental in his Rebuild Texas report as to what do we do when an event happens. We had put a lot of good ideas on the shelves for years and years, partly because the state had never stepped up and funded. Those three pieces of legislation going forward, if we do them as intended with funding as expected, then hopefully the next Harvey, and there will be one, will not have the impact that it had. But it was real. But honestly, the water narrative changed overnight once Harvey hit.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with Charles, and I don't remember the number of the bill. I think it was 1066 here. He's saying synchronization, but harmonizing the permit process from, the production to the exportation of it is huge. I mean, I think it takes a lot of uncertainty out of the game. I agree that the flooding basically sucked all the oxygen out of the room. I was a little disappointed myself in terms of being on the committee. I think we should have paid more attention. Charles was talking about if we had any rain in the area, and we're always in drought. And no matter what's going on, whether it's a flood or not, we should never, ever pivot from what we can do on the groundwater side. And, Lyle had those bills, I think, that address some of that. But I think we had some rain in the interim, and everybody's like, well, it's going to be great. But the truth is, we're never far from a drought, and we're back in it again. And it's sorry that we missed some opportunities to be better at storing water. And I can't remember how many billions of gallons of water we lost during the flooding. I mean, it's an incalculable number of water that we lost. And at some point, we need to ask ourselves, are we really doing all that we can? Not necessarily, preparing for the next flood in terms of legislation and money to rebuild, but to do what we need to do to capture that one thing that's it's coming somewhat priceless. But I think groundwater as always in any session, it dominates our committee. It just seems to be the one thing that dominates, whether you're trying to get a district started, whether you're trying to tweak the way districts work. And I think this session was no different.
Representative King?
Thank you. And, of course, the topic was well covered by Chairman Larson, Senator Perry, and Chairman Nevarez. But the thing that I was thinking about as 50 inches of rain were falling in over what period was it? A couple of days, I guess, wasn't it, for all practical purposes? And was that, to me, it pointed out that that we really need, in my opinion, as difficult as it is, we need to re-examine the way that we do surface water storage and reservoirs in this state, if at all possible. And I know it's a very, very difficult thing in today's environment with the growing population of Texas. But certainly surface water and the storms were the theme of the session. Groundwater, in terms of the themes, we all had a few little things we worked on that we're going to talk about here in a minute. But it was mostly just trying to maintain the status quo is the way that I saw it.
It's interesting you all mentioned flood, and something being from Colorado, drought recovery in Colorado takes years. In Texas, it seems to me that it can take hours if there's a flood. And I think that just kind of drives home that drought and flood are really inextricably linked, or should be. And some of the legislation we saw this session took a step in that direction and bringing flood to the forefront with the Development Board. in doing that. So we'll maybe keep the microphone down with you, Representative King, and I just wanted to ask you about regional issues from the last session. Were there things going on in your region that you were trying to accomplish, that you were watching out for, that are going on now that...
Well, in my particular case, the legislative session for me was all about the Edwards Aquifer Authority and those types of issues. We had a lawsuit pending out there, and about when you could convert the base acre water right, and so I didn't ask for the charge, but my charge during the session became, and Chairman Larson also got caught up in that deal, was trying to figure out some way. And you know, normally when the legislature, if there's a lawsuit pending, that we just don't wade into that. That's just not something that we do. But on this particular one, we made a decision to make the effort, and different parties that were involved eventually came together, and we reached a compromise on a solution to answer that question for the time being and do away with that legislation. And that was what I spent an enormous amount of time working in terms of groundwater issues. I worked on that a lot during the session. So, and there was another Edwards bill that I worked on that ended up taking up a lot of time, and the governor disagreed with our efforts on that one, and so he vetoed that. But that's where my effort was in terms of groundwater.
Representative Nevarez?
Yeah, I had a couple of issues. I had one and then every session since I've been in the legislature, Val Verde County seems to be the one that dominates for me in terms of groundwater. Then you have a kind of mix in with Middle Pecos. But this session we were working on a deal in Culberson County to expand the groundwater district. And the rationale there was not necessarily to get involved in the permit processing or permit process itself, but to kind of monitor what's going on and figure out exactly how much water is being pumped, the quality of the water. It'll help in the water plan, and it just didn't get any legs. And you know, there was some opposition from some landowners, and it was duly noted by the committee. And I disagreed with some of the rationale, because there's really nothing wrong with trying to figure out how much water is being pumped out of these wells. You know, it's a high production area for oil and gas, and there's a need to know. And I think sometimes it's frustrating when you're trying to get to that point, not necessarily expand the groundwater district per se for the permitting process, but just to do that. And then we had a similar situation in Val Verde County where we were, along with the Texas Water Development Board, we were working on figuring out just the quality of the water, the pumping situation at different springs, because Val Verde County is unique in the sense that I think we can say with a real certainty that there's different areas of production, and one may not affect the other the same way. And so these studies are important. And this was a bill that we brought in committee, and then we ended up tacking it onto another bill. I think it was Lyle's bill. No, it was Chuy Hinojosa's bill, I think. And we couldn't keep it on there at the end, and it was frustrating because, again, some of the people in these different counties in Val Verde in particular want the state to step in, or apparently ask for the state to step in. And then when the state steps in, they don't like it. And I don't necessarily agree that the state should step in, but constituents ask me to do that, and I do it. And then it just didn't work out. But I'd like to be more aggressive next session, knowing what I learned this last session on that, in that, because I think it's useful. There's nothing untoward about it. I don't think it's cutting into anybody's property rights. I mean, hell, we have groundwater districts already. It's not like we're inventing them out of whole cloth in the last session. They exist. And if the case was denying somebody their property right, well, then hell, we wouldn't have them. And so I think that's what we need to do.
Thank you. Senator Perry?
Well, my district's pretty quiet on the water district front. We've got several in Senate District 28, 51 counties. It's a large area, but they all do pretty well. Very respectful of landowner rights and permitting and how that goes. I guess specifically a couple of things came up during the session that will definitely impact the interim. I think we've got a question on that, but specifically in my district, we had about 40,000 acres under fire this past weekend. So drought is back. It's real, and that's just one of the ancillary byproducts of a drought, dry land, and get into cattle and stuff. So that's at the forefront. Our rains have been hit and miss. Our agricultural industry, depending on where you were, unfortunately, too much rain impacted the growing season significantly. So we're probably on pace to do one of the worst production in cotton and some of those other secondary crops that come in if cotton's not available. So agri industry in my region has been impacted severely, significantly. Droughts on the front burner. We're moving from 2 to 3 probably sooner than later this month, and possibly into the 4 category, because we don't really typically have a wet fall, other than a little bit in September when dove season starts. First day of dove season, we'll have a lot of rain, so I'm good with that. But that's only that day. But some of the other things, I think during the interim and or actually during session, there was a little bit of some testing of rural water associations and correlative rights issues. I think there's an ongoing litigation, and we can talk a little bit about that on kind of finishing up out here. But some of those issues of challenging, the number of acres to the number of water underneath it, and who owns it and who gets to pull from it, and Kona depression, those are all relevant to you guys today, and I think 2 different cases that are currently working through. So we had a little bit of test of that. I believe it was in Florida in my district. So those are the issues I think that have impacted groundwater. But I would just have to say, and Poncho's right, we should never forget and lack the urgency as a state. And I didn't disagree with Chancellor Sharp, but I would say, in my opinion, the number one thing that the state's not engaged in is water supply development and an urgency there. And we missed some opportunities with floods. Senate Bill 8 requires, or at least prioritizes, those projects that can be flood and supply. If it's got a supply component to it, then it's going to get a higher ranking. I'm trying to force the narrative to every time we can supply new sources of water, we should do that. So, I think that we as a state, and I'm thinking that's where my interim is, and on some issues we're working on, will be to push the narrative to the top of the ladder. You may have water in East Texas, but East Texas is a very small geographical component of the state in whole.
To follow on what Chairman Perry's talking about, dealing with these episodes we've had over the last 3 years, we've had unprecedented rainfall, and we just have done a deplorable job capturing it. We've allowed most of it to run off into the ocean. You contrast that to Florida. They have 26 ASRs, building 15 more all over the western part of the United States. They're building ASRs because it's non-evaporative and you can hold it without it escaping, and we can replenish our aquifers. So we have to do a better job. He's exactly right. Every one of your counties are tasked for flood control. There's never been a water supply element to it, just a separate department at the city and the county. So we're going to integrate that, and for them to qualify for state funding, that's going to be a variable that we're going to look at. And so hopefully we'll encourage that, and it'll take pressure off of the supplies that y'all are managing right now. The more we can put into these aquifers, and especially put them in zones, into brackish zones below your freshwater, and hold it, we're going to be better prepared. Last week, our state was at 10% drought. We're at 22% this week. And if you look at what happened in 2010, 2011, we had a very rainy 2009. 2010, it started subsiding. We got into a horrific drought. We very well could be in that same situation where Charles lives in the Panhandle. They're already in a significant drought. The forecast is for that to continue through the balance of this year. In Central Texas, we've got a drought, and it's extending down into South Texas right now. So the prospects don't look good, but the psychology of water in our state is they look out, the everyday citizen sees those reservoirs full, and they said, we're good. We don't need to do anything. And that's basically, we manage based on the visual aspect of whether there's water in the river or there's water in the reservoirs. Groundwater is the key component that you can't see, and you just hope that they're replenishing. Well, they don't replenish very fast outside of the Edwards. All these other aquifers, some replenish at a glacial pace, and so it's unfortunate. But I agree with what Charles also indicated. Water is our biggest challenge for sustainability in the state, bar none. Because if we go into a significant drought like we did in 2011, We have 3 or 4 years, as forecasted based on tree ring analysis, we will bring this state economy to its knees because we can't supply water for a growing population and a growing industry. So I think that it was unfortunate that we have not taken advantage of the last 3 years of rainfall, but we're not going to make that mistake in the future. And y'all are going to be involved because we're taking water and we're pumping it into the ground. So y'all have to be an integral part of the rulemaking over the next 18 months as we move forward into this new horizon.
So I maybe will go off script just a little bit because I'd love to follow up on that point and just hear, before we look forward to the interim, you know, in the House and the Senate, do you feel like your colleagues are getting that message and understanding the gravity of the situation in terms of how important it is to focus on water supply, even when we're not in that drought, recognizing how fast it can change?
A handful of 150 members in the House, a handful get it. You know, they don't. It's not an issue until your constituents start talking to you. Y'all all know your state reps and state senators, and you talk to them. But from my perspective, is in 2011, 2012, people were laser focused on this. They were worried about what we were going to do, and then it dissipates as quickly as it rose, and the interest level at the same level. I've got people on my committee, and I've got a couple right here. They understand it. They understand the importance for us to continue to manage it and understand this is a big issue. But most are involved in other issues. They're involved in healthcare, they're infrastructure, all kinds of issues. And water, they defer to us, and they hope that we're making the right decisions. So there'll be a lot of calamity if we have a significant drought. Then everybody will be pressed. Unfortunately, that's not the time to plan. You plan when the rivers are full and the lakes are full, but it's counter to that in a legislative process. When you're elected every 2 years or elected every 4 years, you're basing a lot of policy decisions on the next election cycle, and we're not looking and projecting out 10, 15, 25 years. I think SB 8, SB 7, some of those dealing with flood control mitigation, that is looking long-term and understanding that we're going to have impacts. The groundwater stuff and a lot of the surface water legislation, I think ASRs and desalination, those are long-term fixes to problems that we see over the horizon.
Did you want to add anything to that, Senator Perry?
No, there's no sense of urgency other than a very few, and I could name them, and they deserve naming, but that would mean I would leave out a whole lot of others, and it's not because they don't understand. Let me rephrase it. It's not because they don't care about water, they just don't worry about water, and that's a big distinction, I think. I think we are charged with caring about water and water supply, and I think my interim is going to focus very much on new water supply opportunities, specifically in the West Texas region. I'm excited about that. And it's incumbent upon guys like ourselves, or people, to present it in a fashion where it makes public policy sense. And that's hard to do when there's not someone with a gun to your head like a drought. But at the same time, I do sense that even out of the governor's office and LightGov's office last session, at the end of the session, once Harvey was kind of put to bed and we'd done what we tried to, our objectives have been met, that water supply, at least from internal conversations, has moved up to a level that it hasn't been there before. But my members, they're busy. They got their, in the Senate we'll have close to 1 million people in redistricting, so they're a little bit busy doing those constituent services they're demanding on us. But we have to stay above that fray and keep moving forward on these things that make Texas water supply secure.
And I'll actually leave the microphone with you for a minute maybe, and you've already, I think, done the transition into my next question and covered some of it, but I'd like to just talk about the interim a little bit more and what we might see in terms of interim charges from your committee.
Yeah, we'll have several, but specifically the big one that I'm hoping, and we've already asked for it from the LightGov's office to do it, water supply with regards to produced water. There was some legislation in the last session that clarified kind of the ownership of that. We'll see if it gets challenged or not. I think my landowners understood there's a cost to cleaning up produced water. and who bears that cost is either need to be reimbursed or either it's their water. So we'll see kind of how that transfers out. But just very tail end of the session, on the very last day of finance hearings, we had a proposal from some major oil producers that they were looking for a subsidy to, franchise tax subsidy to, quote, for produced water reuse and some things that they wanted to do with that. And I used to work in the oil field, and I know how you tell a guy that's never been in the oil field, if you ask them how many barrels of water or gallons of oil or gallons of water in an oil gas production is, and if they say 55, you know they're not oil gas people. It's 42. So just very quickly on a calculator, I calculated 60% recovery rate of the produced water. If you get 60% of it at 42 gallons per barrel, at 7 barrels per oil barrel produced at our current production levels, we're in 1.4 trillion gallons of fresh water supply potentially. And we always stop the conversation with, well, it's going to cost too much. The truth of the matter is the technology exists. The question is it scalable? And is there a feedstock of produced water that justifies an investment to try it? The interim will focus on that issue. I think the Permian Basin, from what I can gather, is the only place in the world, if not at least this country, that can guarantee a supply of produced water that would justify an investment to see if we can turn that into fresh water supply going forward. And so I'm committed over the interim. We're having a whole host of internal meetings trying to pick who needs to be in those discussions, who are serious about finding solutions. The math on that alone, 9.8 million households in Texas, 1 year water supply at 60% recovery rate. So it's one of those issues we've ignored. It's one we've always talked about, and independents and producers are doing it internally for their own reuse. The question becomes is, can we gather it and scale it and recharge Ogallala? I think 50% of our ag production is dependent upon Ogallala supply, and it's not dry. But we need to be cognizant of the fact we're pulling from something that doesn't recharge, or we can put it into river basins and send it down. So that is what I'm excited about, water supply discussion, and that will be, I think, Rose, if we get it right and can show where economically it makes sense and show how it can be paid for, I think we have industry as well as state moving in the right direction.
And we actually heard from some of those industries this morning in one of our panels, so your comments really dovetail nicely into that. We'll maybe continue down this way and then circle back to the House. Representative Nevarez, of course you'll be working on the issues that come up in the interim charges on committee. Are there any other issues that you plan to be tracking or working on over the interim?
You know what? That one's big. It's big because, the bill that came out last session, I think there's just kind of like Lyle's ASR bills, there's so many ancillary things that you can do along with that. And then when you look at the Permian Basin, I mean, there's no doubt that the area has to lead when it comes to produced water, and not just in. And I mean, it's some people may not agree with the subsidy issue, and some people didn't agree with some subsidy issues I had this session too, so I understand that. But the truth is, there's probably not a more important issue going forward in terms of what we can do to recharge, for instance, the aquifer in the Panhandle, which doesn't recharge. And I there's always going to be something, regional in terms of the county and the groundwater district. When you're talking about a global approach to what we're doing, west of I-35 in terms of produced water, this is it. And I'm glad to hear Charles say that, because I couldn't agree more with that.
Representative King.
Well, I'm going to be continuing to monitor the back and forth between in terms of groundwater and the property rights issue and the rights of the folks that are involved in it, and that's something that never goes away. The produced water issue is a big issue, turned into a big issue last session, and I think it's interesting. I think we need to encourage all of that recycling effort that we can. I'm just not sure what role the government or the legislature should play in the ownership of that water. It seems like that would be more of a contractual issue between the folks that are involved in that particular production. But we'll see as time goes on what it is. Obviously, if one of the parties has the opportunity to increase their percentages in their hand through the legislature, where they're going to take advantage of that. 90% of the bills that we deal with have to do with money changing hand from one to the other, and 10% of them have to do with some kind of social issue. So there's no question that people will come to the legislature with a really, really cool argument about why we ought to be involved in it. I'm just not sure that we should. But and then we'll continue on the Edwards Aquifer Authority. That's been part of my legislative life ever since I've been in the legislature. So we'll continue to watch that. We'll see if that bill that had to do with the conversion of those base acre water rights, how it actually plays out over the next few years.
And then Representative Larson, I was hoping you could talk about what we might see from the House Natural Resources Committee in terms of
I
interim
think Senator
charges.
Perry hit on the big one. Obviously, Summer and Ty, they had to deal with it. They're seeing a number of oil companies coming in using a lot of fresh water out of those West Texas aquifers, a lot of pressure in the Delaware Basin and the Permian Basin. The other side of it, you go into East Texas, they don't have the geology to have saltwater disposal wells. They're taking that water to Louisiana. And so very similar that they've got in Pennsylvania, they're taking that water to Ohio because they can't pressure up and inject with saltwater disposal wells. So that's the other side of it. If we're going to continue to see the Haynesville develop and the state obviously benefits from the severance tax, we've got to create some situation where the recycling of that water, where they're not exporting that water into an adjacent state. But that is going to be the focus, is West Texas. The other thing is the interaction between surface and groundwater. We've had a series of hearings over the last couple of interims talking about it, going to the Devil's River, going to the San Saba, and talking about the pressure. I think the Water Development Board estimated 30% of all the surface water that we've got in the state originates from groundwater, and the connectivity. We've got it in the Brazos, the alluvium there. You pump it and you have an impact on the flows in the river if you overpump it. We got a federal lawsuit with New Mexico about 3,000 wells were put along the Rio Grande. They're drying it up before it goes in to Elephant Butte. So somewhere, and it's a very difficult issue, we've got to navigate in and between the interaction between surface and groundwater. DFCs, I know there's a number of people that have talked about reform on DFCs, consistency within a region, that the desired future conditions of the aquifer can't deviate in the same GMA. Everybody agrees, but then you have groundwater districts that are altering their DFCs. Well, it has a dramatic impact on their neighbors if they're not using the same science and using the same GAM models. So I think that that's equally important. Again, the regionalization aspect of it, continue to talk about that as well. But I think first and foremost is to produce water and whatever we can to encourage more recycling.
Thank you. So I wanted to open it up to audience questions for a little bit and then save time to give you each an opportunity to make a few closing remarks. And I'll first look to the microphones if there are folks that would like to ask from the audience. I do have one or two here that have been submitted via technology, but step to the mic, please.
Hi, my name is Stephen Fulmer. I'm a graduate student at University of Houston Clear Lake. For the past year and a half, I've been studying the flooding of Houston because I started grad school the semester after Harvey hit. I live within the neighborhood of Brays Bayou, right next to Meyerland, and I've seen how bad the community has been destroyed. I see the architecture has changed within my neighborhood, where there's people been lifted 10 feet above the floodplain just because they got flooded 3 times. This, from what I've learned from this conference so far, is how different this state is, of hearing about the wasted water of what happened from Harvey, of how much water we lost. In Houston, we don't worry about droughts too much. We don't worry about that. We worry about, hey, we want more detention ponds. We want to be able to get this water down to the Gulf as fast as humanly possible. My question is, how can we, everybody in this room, how can we all work together? How can you all work with the Harris County Flood Control District? I've looked at their plans. Right now, they're not worried about West Texas. No offense, they're not worried about Amarillo. what they are worried about, how can we reduce the flooding, because my neighborhood has been a floodplain for the past few years. And all the Harris County Flood Control District is worried about is trying to put detention wherever they can try to figure out. Or I've heard about the big plan to try to put some gigantic tube going down to the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay, let's let the legislators have an opportunity to respond to that. Thank
Okay.
you. Would you like to?
The heart of Senate Bill 8 is specifically, and this is the revolutionary change that it just escapes common sense, watershed basin planning. So you're correct that prior to SB 8, whichever city jurisdiction had the most resource moved their flood problem onto their neighbors or downstream or to their sides and said, well, we're fixed. And that's not a slam. They were satisfying their issue. Senate Bill 8 requires a uniform discussion from all parties on a watershed basin, which will therefore force flood control up and down the basin so that not one area or the other is getting flooded by their neighbor for fixing their own problem. It'll be a better resource utilization expectation. It forces the communication coordination in order to get state funding. So if you fund it, you get a little bit of help from the coordination there. As far as you not being worried about drought, you need to do a little work on subsidence. If you go into a drought, your earth in Houston, Harris County area will open up and swallow up things. So you are drought prone and have drought issues very short order if it doesn't rain. But what the bigger discussion in the state is we're going to force communication, collaboration, and coordination of all of these watersheds to work in tandem so that one's not hurting the other, but yet in collective. So someone further south in Harris County, down path of those rivers, didn't have resources to do proper flood control, right? If you do it right on the top and you're working in conjunction, maybe they didn't have to have those resources. So that's the plan going forward. I can't address it today. I do think it's a bigger global picture for local jurisdictions. Do you allow people to build in floodplains? City of Houston stepped up, raised the stilts on the house, but there is got to be some common sense interjected there on an ordinance level as to what is an allowable. If you build below or at sea level, you need to be prepared for floods. Secondly, you need to know that you don't have flood insurance 99% of the time. And so when one happens, you need to be able to have those resources. But the state is forcing the hand. If you want state money, you will plan accordingly that will address some of the things you're seeing and doing.
Thank you. Unless any of you, I will move on to the next question. I got a couple
Right.
via our
Thank you,
very
gentlemen.
fancy conference app here. So the question is, each of you represents a different groundwater region in the state with different constituencies and needs. What do you wish others in the state understood about your local water issues? And maybe we'll let Representative Nevarez begin.
I think that question kind of encapsulates what the problem is sometimes when you're dealing with water is people in Houston, and rightly so, they're worried about flooding. Well, we don't worry about it. It's kind of an esoteric idea, and it's somewhat welcome in some cases. And I think the clash between, and Tracy brought this up, where the protection of the resource and the rights of the property owner intersect, that's always a big challenge. It's a big challenge in my district. I can't imagine it wouldn't be so in somebody else's. But I think even from groundwater district and county to county, it varies because you have some populations that, and I mean neighboring counties where the issue of pumping, producing, exporting, and marketing water isn't as big a deal as it might be in another county. And navigating, pun intended, navigating that as an elected official, not just somebody who's got an opinion or has a means to end a dispute, but navigating it just as an elected official can be somewhat harrowing. I remember, my first session, I can't remember who told me, it's like, hey man, water's not just wet around here, and it's true. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on, and I don't know, I think the biggest divide between members now, when you're talking about whether other members are in tune with what we're facing drought-wise, is it's not Republican and Democrat. It's the issue regarding water, and it's rural and urban, and those who identify as rural, because that's really the divide you see when somebody starts thinking about what we're doing with water in the state. It's not Republican or Democrat. It's rural and urban, and it's weird, but that's how it's done.
Yeah. Representative King?
Well, I wish there was some way for the different legislators from different parts of the state and for the citizens of different parts of the state to understand that that no two groundwater districts are exactly alike. And we have a lot of them, certainly those that cover the Ogallala and West Texas out there, that are very, very similar and could certainly have one set of rules for all of them might work. But there's a lot of difference between a groundwater district that may someday in utopian society be set up in Del Rio and a groundwater district in East Texas, or one down in, the Winter Garden, which I represent, or the Evergreen, which I represent, or certainly the Edwards Aquifer Authority. I think most people just don't understand the challenges you have trying to draft a set of rules and come up with a board that will then be approved by the voters in the different parts of the state. So
I got a great story about that. Is my first session on the committee when Keffer was the chairman, we had a long night of a hearing on the groundwater district in Val Verde, and I got beat to hell on the deal, and I dragged myself back to the next committee hearing. Jeannie Morrison walks in, and she's got a groundwater district she's going to form, and it's 3 pages. She gets up there, presents it. One person testifies. It passes out of the committee, gets out of the House, and there's a groundwater district. So I was sitting there thinking to myself, how come I couldn't do it like that?
Senator Perry, did you have anything you wanted to add on that in terms of the regional issues you'd like others in the state to understand?
Well, I'm not the poster child of groundwater districts for a lot of reasons based on several sessions of filing. I'll just sum it up this way. I think currently there's some cases that I've been talking about that were coming, and they're here today. And I think you see as urban sprawl continues, you're going to be more challenged and more challenged and more challenged. So I would just say it this way. If you can't explain your mission in clear terms and exactly how you meet that mission through science, then as a legislature, I have concerns that you will have a shorter tenure than you probably should. I am not against water district management of a limited resource. I believe the state showed some wisdom in trying to manage a finite resource with infinite uses. At the same time, I think I'm very clear and have been consistent with this, much to some of the representatives of your association's chagrin, that if you can't explain what you're doing and why you're doing it with scientifically based reasons, then I don't know how we can defend the need for a water district in the legislature to urban sprawl and the things that are coming that want your water worse than your ability to defend it.
Representative Larson.
The area I represent is the Edwards Aquifer, and I've got the Trinity. The Trinity's also in the northern part of my district. I think the Edwards unique situation. I was on the city council when it passed in '93, and look at how it's evolved. Statutorily, it was set up so it's unlike any of the other districts that are represented here. But looking at it, there's some things that have evolved out of it. First of all, you have a water market that is been fully developed. Water was selling for about $600 an acre foot out of the aquifer in 1993. It's selling for $5,000 an acre foot. So the true market value of water versus any place in the state of Texas, because they put a cap on it, you know how much you can extract. We've got a water market. And I think the value of the water is grossly underestimated. Of any commodity in the state of Texas, water is the one that is undervalued, just about in every circumstance, whatever the use is, the class of use, whether it be ag, municipal, or industrial. So I think somewhere we've got to start figuring out the value of it. When you get to that value, then you're going to augment conservation, because people will waste whether it's water or any resource if they're not paying what the full value of it is. And that's whether it be at the surface water, we artificially deflate the value as owners of the surface water. As a state, we deflate it. We base it on 40-year bonds that were sold when a lot of the reservoirs were built in the response to the drought of the 1950s. Well, now we just maintain it. We don't value it. And I'll give you a perfect example. In the Brazos, and we had a big bill, and Charles helped me get it through the Senate, dealing with building another reservoir. If you look at the run of the Brazos, the value of that water is selling at, I believe, $87, the system rate for that water. To build one reservoir for 100,000 acre-feet of water, it's going to cost $500 million. So that's $500 water. To supplant water in the lower basin with desal is going to cost you $1,300 to $1,400. But we're charging $87. So somewhere between $87 and $1,400 is the true value of what that water's worth in the lower basin of the Brazos. You can take that same model and what it costs you to supplant water out of any of the aquifers using technology, whether it be desalination or importing water from another region, the cost goes up exponentially. So I think one of the issues is government should step away, and we should let the value of the water be developed under a free market system. If that happens, you're going to see a hell of a lot more conservation across this state, like it has been all over the world, where they put free market principles into water. So I think the Edwards is a great model. I mean, that water was free from what most people thought, whether they live in Uvalde or they live in Bexar County. Now that water's $5,000 an acre foot, and that is coming to y'all soon. And you can see, I know some of the people that are seeing the export projects come out of their area. You can see what people are paying for that water. You know, not only the cost of conveyance, but leasing or buying the water from the landowners.
Thank you. And I think we're getting to that time where I was just going to give you each an opportunity. Oh, we have another question? One last question, sure.
I don't have to state my question. That's all right. I don't envy you gentlemen at all for dealing with the public and what you do. It's a hard job all the way around.
Can you speak into the mic a bit more? It's hard to hear.
Mr. Larson, I do agree with your, we don't need to wait. The problem, reaction, solution is always a bad deal, especially in politics. But my big general statement, GCD boards are elected by their community. And we're set up in government in general to be bottom up. Is that correct? All right. My question is, whose science, and this is Mr. Perry, and I'm just picking at you a little bit, whose science do you use when a groundwater district needs to justify their existence? Do you use the local group that spends their taxpayer money to find the best science available, try to hire the best researchers available, or do you use the state?
So here's what I'm going to answer it. First of all, I just want to know that there's science in every water district's DFC calculation. I haven't gotten confirmation that every DFC at a water district level has science-backed data. Nobody's been able to I'm not saying they're not. I'm not saying the majority are. But to date, I can't tell you in earnest that of the 100 water districts, every one of them can support their DFCs and their calculations based on science. So if that can be resolved, then I probably go on with my way. But to date, I have not had that data, that comfort, and I have not had an explanation by water districts. This is my water district over my aquifer system that's unique because of this, and this is why we do it. What I hear is landowners come in and say, I don't know where they got it because two fences over, same property, I got a different DFC. So that makes no sense to me if you're, quote, using science. The answer to your question, we spend almost $20-some-odd billion with our university systems. And then you add another layer of very sophisticated water hydrologist work done on municipal levels. So Water Development Board is tasked with kind of getting a lot of that information internally in keeping. So we kind of have a database or a reservoir, but a lot of this, I'm saying, is already done, and the state does have a role through university research for water specifically up in my area. So can the district go out on its own and use those fees or tax base, whatever it is, to do their own? And I think High Plains Water District has their internal data. Some are big enough to do it, some are not. If you're not big enough to do it, find a way to do it. But I would just like to know that every district's got a DFC that's backed by scientific data. You ask a question, my premise is I can't guarantee that that's the case. And if that's not the case, then how do I advocate for a water district need in a legislature where I have more urban people screaming, we're going to get you water and we want to move that water?
Thank you for your question. So it is time for us.
Yeah, I'd like to address that too. I mean, we did fund the GAMS for the Water Development Board, so hopefully we'll see a continued evolution of the sophistication of the model that we're using. If you have any complaints about the GAMS, Dr. Mace is sitting right there, and he's trying to go off onto the Meadows Foundation, but he's been the chief scientist for a number of years, and there are different levels of sophistication, and a lot of it's resource driven. Some of the groundwater districts have been able to afford getting out and doing state-of-the-art modeling. I've seen Janet's in the Hemphill. I've seen the Edwards. I've seen their modeling is as good as any. And then there's some groundwater districts I've met with that just they never had the resources. They had geological surveys by USGS. They had the ability to do some limited modeling on one of their minor aquifers or one of their aquifers and leave 2 or 3 aquifers out. So it's a work in progress. So I think that the DFC aspect of it, there's been some gaming, and I think everybody understands that from the GAMS and on what variables you put into the model, and you can sort of predetermine. But I think we've got away from that. Over the last few years, the veracity of the information that's being provided at the Water Development Board, I think the checks and balances is a lot more rigid than what we've seen in the past. So I think we're getting there. So, but thank you for your question.
Thank you. So first, I would love for you guys to sit tight after you finish your closing remarks, because I do have a resolution from the Texas Alliance of Groundwater Districts. I've been saying the Water Development Board so many times that I am getting all confused. But we passed a resolution to thank you all for your hard work on behalf of groundwater and the people of Texas that I'd like to present you with. And I'd like the audience to sit tight because I have some announcements to make, and I would love for you to hear them. So with that, I'll start with you and just give you an opportunity to make a closing remark.
Hey, thank all of y'all for doing what you do. That's a tough job. I know that some of the board meetings across the state have been pretty combative. You've got people that want y'all to protect the water in your area. That's not the role of a groundwater district. It's to manage the resource and not to keep it within certain boundaries. And I think that that's where we've got to grow as a state. Your county is part of a state, and resources are going to have to be shared like they are in all aspects of state government, whether you have the tax base to build the roads, the health care, all of that. We share water in the same regard. And as a growing state, the rural areas should not suffer because of the population areas needed. There should be some kind of collaborative partnership, but it should be science-driven. And if there is it's going to be to the detriment of an aquifer, then we need to move to other resources. But I appreciate the work that all of you do. I've met with several of you in your hometowns, and my hat's off, and appreciate your work in the legislative session.
Thank you.
I do want to thank you guys for your efforts and your energies and your work. You've got an untenable task. Again, trying to manage the only resource that matters. I tell everybody I can drive my car less. If the gasoline goes away, I can live for about 10 days without water. And I think sometimes we forget just how critical water supply and in industry development, all the things we know. I would just ask this, as the next session comes on board and initiatives like developing new supplies, produced water, marine desal, aquifer storage, that your association get out there and support those initiatives. Even if you may not like a little bit of some of the stuff involved in them. If the state does not have a bigger discussion in a more legitimate and sincere way, your task and my task, it really doesn't matter what we're doing today, because 30 years out, my grandkids won't be able to live in West Texas. And so I just ask for your support on the bigger debates of the day. We'll work through our stuff. I'm not naive to the fact that there's people in this audience that don't really like some of my perspectives. I'm really here to try to help you. I just need you guys to help yourself first.
Thank you, Charles. And thank you all for cutting your tea time short, if you did, and allowing your stomachs to grumble a little bit while we did our deal. But, one of the things that, Charles was talking about, your association getting behind some of the things that will be happening in future sessions. One, I think, that we did last session with respect to, watershed, when talking about the flood, is bringing the watersheds that seem to be a little less apt in protecting themselves up to speed, with money, because that's what it takes. And I think that's something that we need to do when we're talking about modeling water is, there's some poor brothers and sisters when it comes to groundwater districts that would love to be able to model and do the things that some other groundwater districts do because they've got more permit money coming in and they can't. And I think that's somewhere where we should be able to look, or should look at, in terms of getting that, getting everybody at the same level, because there's no reason why we shouldn't do that. The other thing I'd like to point out that I think is probably more important, at least to me, is Lyle is now using the word regionalization instead of balkanization, which is a big deal for Lyle. That's a big deal. And I don't know if y'all caught that, but I caught it. So there's that. So just to
I just want to thank y'all for inviting me to be a part of this panel, and I appreciate the hard work that all of you do and that everybody on this panel does. I did, somebody was asking about the flooding there in Houston earlier, and I think it was pretty significant that when you look at the number of committee members that were appointed to the House Natural Resources Committee this time, there's a disproportionate share of them from the coastal areas, and that was obviously a reflection of the efforts that needed to be put in that area, and I think we did a lot towards that. But again, I just want to thank you for having me here this morning.
Let's give our panelists a big round of applause. Thank you so much for being here. Stay. Please stay.